You know, the Bible says a lot about creation. Not about the act of creating like we find in Genesis 1, but just about the creation around us. I mean, it talks a lot about creation, which would make sense because you and I live in it. We experience it every single day of our lives. And so it makes sense that the Bible would have a great deal to say about creation. I want to focus on one aspect of creation the Bible talks about that, shockingly enough, is the most common way that creation is described in the Bible on this week's edition of Theology Thursday. The Bible says very little about us worshiping because of creation, which would make sense because the nations worshiped creation. They worshiped the mountains and the hills and the birds and the stars and the sun, the moon, and all that. And so the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about, wow, look at that sunset. That should lead to worship. The Bible just doesn't do that, and for obvious reasons, because of the culture and the world in which they lived and existed. However, the Bible talks an awful lot, I mean an awful lot, about the dangers of creation. The Bible is just full of it. It's full of the dangers of creation. The Old Testament, the New Testament, and let's just think about it in the New Testament, just even in Jesus' life, what we see in terms of the dangers of creation. People are getting hungry. There's nothing to feed them. There are wild storms that Jesus walks on the water and calms the storm, and the apostles are amazed at it. There are warnings about storms that are coming. Even the return of Jesus is going to be accompanied by creation phenomena. He's going to come in the clouds of glory. And so we see, the dangers of, or at least we see the dangers of creation. Or the Apostle Paul, he's shipwrecked. He's deprived. He has to deal with heat, with cold, and with rain and snow and all these kind of things. The dangers of creation are all around us everywhere. Let me just kind of walk through some of them that we find in the Old Testament. There's one in particular that I want to look at, and then I want to talk about why I think the Bible talks so much about the dangers of creation. I guess the biggest danger of creation that ever occurred was the flood, Genesis 6 through 9. God warns he's going to destroy the earth by a flood. And so the Bible says the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That's where most of the flooding came from. And then it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, which would have brought more flooding, but primarily it was the breaking up of the fountains of the deep, which probably was a lot of under-ocean tectonic uplifting and volcanoes and other such things like that would have just blasted water and steam all over the place. And of course, eventually that steam would form around dust particles in the sky, form water vapor, and it would fall in the form of rain. So it makes sense. They break up, and then that creates rain for almost a month and a half. So that's the biggest one. We see the danger of flooding. It's really interesting. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and then they take his coat, they shred it, and kill one of the sheep and put his blood on the cloak, and then they take it to their father. Jacob's assumption is he was attacked and killed by a wild animal. Like Jacob didn't assume, oh, this is fake. Jacob didn't assume that it was by criminals. He recognized the danger of wild animals and that Joseph, going to find his brothers, encountered some wild beast, whether it was wolves or it was some kind of lion or wild dogs or whatever it was. He was attacked by either a wild animal or a pack of wild animals, and that he was killed. I mean, that was just the obvious assumption to him, because when you walk everywhere, there were just wild animals. I mean, you're just walking down dirt roads. There are wild animals that could attack you, either because they're hungry or they're rabid or for whatever reason. David tells us that he had by hand to fight off the bear and fight off the lion to protect the flocks. Fighting off these wild beasts was a part of the job if you were a shepherd. Psalm 121 is interesting. It says, I look to the hills. You always went up to Jerusalem because it's among several hills and sits on a hill. The name of the hill, by the way, is called Zion. And so you would always head up into the mountains, whether you're headed north, south, east, or west Jerusalem, didn't matter. So when I look up to the hills, Where does my help come from? The hills are dangerous, both from robbers, criminals, and again, from wild animals or rock slides or steep cliffs that you could fall off of. I mean, there's dangers all around in creation. Well, my help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. He'll preserve you going out and coming in. He says, man, when I look, I see the dangers of creation. And so I'm asking, where am I going to get help for this? At least twice, God speaks from a tornado. Most translations use the word whirlwind, but a whirlwind's a tornado. He does it to Job in Job 38 to 41. And then in the book of Habakkuk, there's a Scirocco, a tornado-like, a big dust storm that comes in, and God speaks from this whirlwind in Habakkuk chapter 3. And so, tornadoes were a danger. I mean, the Bible's just full, Old and New Testaments, about all these different dangers that are out there in creation. Psalm 29 may be the most instructive for us when we think about how dangerous creation is. So Psalm 29 says, a psalm of David, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, ascribe to the Lord the glory, do his name, worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Now, what's going to lead to this worship? A storm. Verse 3, the voice of the Lord is over the waters, the God of glory thunders, the Lord over many waters, the voice of the Lord is powerful, the voice of the Lord is full of majesty. So he's over the Mediterranean Sea, and this is thunder. This is a storm that's rolling in, which we know that's what they do. They roll in off the Mediterranean. Now the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon to skip like a calf and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. So he's come in over Lebanon. Now we're over land, and now we're going to head south as he moves down. Verse 9, the voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth and strips the forest bare, and in his temple all cry glory. So why people run to the temple? Because the temple is made of stone. Most people lived in a mud house, which could be destroyed in a storm. It was dangerous. The temple is secure and safe. And so we have this massive storm coming in. They can see it coming. It's coming off the Mediterranean, over Lebanon, and now it's headed south, down through the land, wreaking havoc and destruction in its path. And all the people run to the temple for physical safety. Then the last two verses are significant. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. So that's speaking about the flood back in Genesis 6 through 9. So here's what he says. God was more powerful than the most powerful storm ever, the one that flooded the earth. May the Lord give strength in his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. So if God was over that one, he's over this one. We can trust God. So why in the world is a storm a motivation for worship? Because of the power and unstoppability of a storm. It's pretty cool what modern technology does. It can spot tornadoes forming. There are warnings that there is a tornado. There are watches there could be a tornado. We lived for a decade in South Louisiana. The hurricanes, we would see them form as a tropical depression and then move into a tropical storm and then become a hurricane once it reached a certain strength. And then, of course, there's different categories of hurricanes, and they would make landfall. Now, we would see them coming. We can't stop them. We can just tell you that they're coming. But even then, they're unpredictable. Sometimes they would turn and go up into Alabama or somewhere, or they would continue over and come up through Louisiana, or they would turn and go up the East Coast, up through the Carolinas. Like they're even when we look at them, they'll show a band like this is the possible path. It could strike anywhere from here to here. And so they are powerful and unstoppable and unpredictable, but God is more powerful. So these weather extremes, the wild animals, the cliffs that you could fall off of, the extreme heat, extreme cold, these are reminders of how dangerous creation is, but also remind us how powerful and how good God is. One of the things that I found fascinating is being a pastor here for over 20 years in the desert in Arizona is extreme environments either repulse people or draw people. So some people come, they'll spend a summer or two and they go home. It's like Alaska. Alaska is extreme as well. They're extreme on the other end, extreme cold, but they have it's an extreme environment as well. Personally, I thrive in an extreme environment. I find it to be a challenge. I find it to just to call me. The desert just speaks to me. I love to be out in the desert. This year, I've already seen 6 rattlesnakes. Normally, I see about 4, maybe 5 in an entire year from spring all the way into late fall. Already, just in the spring this year, I've encountered half a dozen rattlesnakes while out either mountain biking or hiking. One of them actually rode over on my mountain bike. And so I like it. I like living in an extreme, dangerous environment. It reminds me of how frail I am compared to the world that God has made, the dangers of creation, but it's also a reminder about the power and the majesty and the greatness of God. I mean, the apostles were stunned that Jesus had the power to calm the storm. They said, "What manner of man is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" God's power over the dangers of creation leads us to worship. You and I live in a dangerous world. You and I encounter dangers all the time. Flooding, drowning, storms, hurricanes, tornadoes. Where I live, we get these massive dust storms with very high winds that are very, very dangerous. They tell you just pull over on the side of the road and shut your car down. We live in a world, I live in a world with scorpions and rattlesnakes and Gila monsters. Tarantulas and all kinds of black widows are everywhere. We live in a world that's dangerous. That leads us to worship and to trust God, like Psalm 121 says. I look to the hills, man, I look to the danger. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. So as you're out this week, think not just about the beauty of creation, but all the dangers that are around you all the time. All the time. Some of you live in places where there's poison ivy and poison oak and ticks and things like that. All of us live in a world where there are all kinds of germs and viruses and bacteria that we're exposed to that are dangerous. So just think about how dangerous it is. But remember, God is more powerful and worthy to worship. And when we see the power and the fury and the wrath and the might of a dangerous creation, that we can say in the temple, glory, because our God sits enthroned over the flood. He sat enthroned over the greatest danger of them all. He sits enthroned over these as well. So just when you see the dangers of creation over the next few weeks, be reminded that they call us to worship, not just the beauty of creation. So God bless you. Hope you have a great day and a great next few weeks.